November 24th, 2024, coming to you live from the Dome in Las Vegas. Charles Bent in a t-shirt, just got off the stage playing with the Eagles. Philip Miller playing with the Raptors, point guard. We're good to go. What? You've seen my work. You've seen my work down in Dallas. What's up, Tall Chuck?
Man, it's 80 degrees down here in the end of November in Dallas, Texas. It's sunny and beautiful. There's like a week in the fall and a week in the spring, which is exactly why everybody lives here the other 50 weeks out of the year.
Really?
Makes sense.
Well, seems like a lot of housing to pay for 1 week a year or 2 weeks.
It does. It really does.
I just came back from Boston, and can I go on a rant right now about chowder?
Please.
So I love clam chowder. It's just my little thing. Everywhere I go, I order chowder. And I've had corn chowder. I've had potato chowder. When I order clam chowder, why are there so many fucking potatoes in my clam chowder? Because when I order potato chowder, there's not a lot of clams in there, right? This chowder, it's called clam chowder, but the clam to potato ratio is totally off. Whereas when I eat potato chowder, it's a potato bonanza. And I asked a bunch of people in Boston. They all told me to get the fuck out of the restaurant because clearly they don't like anybody criticizing their clam chowder. But best clam chowder I found is in this restaurant called Earl's in Canada. But I just learned that in Boston, people aren't so friendly about hearing somebody criticize their clam chowder. New England clam chowder.
Did you really get thrown out of a restaurant for complaining about the chowder?
I kind of hinted like you could pack up if you don't like the chowder. And I was like, I just want to talk to a chef and have somebody explain to me why there's so many goddamn potatoes in something that is called clam chowder. It's not called clam and potato chowder, Potatoes maybe somebody could.
Potatoes are cheap.
Yeah, they're cheap fillers, right? That's what it is. But Camille and I were talking out of branding perspective. Why don't people make things the best? Like we were even talking about bread in restaurants. We were at a restaurant, and if every restaurant provides bread, what's the purpose of giving average bread? You're competing on steaks, which are so expensive. Why not have the best bread? Like it's hard to differentiate yourself with steaks if you're buying the top cuts. We went to a place that had the best bread, and even though the restaurant was amazing, all we did was talk about that place had the best bread we ever had.
Yeah,
Probably applicable in your law firm. Have parts of your experience that are disproportionately better than anything else, and that stands out to greater impact than other things.
There's a study, I think it was in a Malcolm Gladwell book about doctors getting sued for malpractice. And the study found that doctors with good bedside manners that were social and nice and appreciative and listened, or the patients thought they listened or whatever, got sued far less than the doctors who were assholes and jerks. And it was the same care, same level of mistakes, same level of screw ups, but the people that had nice doctors wouldn't sue their nice doctor.
No, that stat is very true. We worked on that in another area of consulting I was in. And if they know they made a mistake and they come in and apologize and explain it, the patient won't want to sue, but the machinery tells them never admit a mistake. And so you get more surgeries because the bureaucracy tells them not to do it. And I think lawyers and doctors generally have an obstacle to actually admitting a mistake. Like I think when they do it, they get embarrassed. It's not that they're bad people. They'd rather kind of shelve it and hope it goes away because we're not really taught to have real conversations with people. I do that after every trial. I always think about what I could do to make it better and wish I could do it again. Have you ever heard of there's a French term, I don't know if it's that relevant, called the esprit d'escalator, which it's also called stairway wisdom. And it means like when you're talking, pardon?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Like when you're talking and you give like an answer that's kind of okay. And then as you're walking your way, you're like, damn, I should have said this. I should have answered this when the judge said that. Stairway wisdom. Anyhow.
Oh, I love that. I think it's true. But I also think it's important to analyze those because they help prepare you for the next time. So when I have a trial or even a big hearing, I will always go home that night and think about it, write some things down, record myself thinking about it, and just kind of try to get better. Because I think we've talked about this before, is one of my biggest regrets in my basketball career is that my coaches never made us watch film when we won. We only watched
Mhm.
film when we lost. And I mean, what's the difference in how you played 98% of the game if you win or lose by 1 point? Not much. Are there opportunities to improve? Are there opportunities to improve when you win by 1 point? There better be. Yeah.
Film in sport has been one of the number one ways for teams to win, and actually soccer led the way in Europe, and we could learn a lot. My buddy is a German Croatian coach, and their use of film is so spectacular compared to what we were doing in North America up until 5 years ago. And in fact, I have a Portuguese friend who coached soccer in Germany, and he's working for the Celtics, and he does video of every basketball game. He gets from the coach what the assignments were for the player, and then there's a camera that only watches the player, and then he just highlights over top of the video where they didn't pick up their assignment or where they did, and then gives them a ratio of how much they accomplished their mission. And it's amazing that a soccer person has helped transform that basketball element.
I love it. That's great.
But
That's
our tape, our video review, I find is kind of when I do an appeal, and I get to read my own transcripts,
yeah.
right? Like I think the one thing I think in law school, you might disagree with, I find reading cases so less helpful than reading trial transcripts when evidentiary things come in. And I think law school wants to remain hierarchical or whatever. But I love reading actual trial transcripts. Like watch, and because you can read twice as fast as you can watch, right? But listening to the cross and then seeing myself and then going, if anybody wants to get better and you can get transcripts, read transcripts of your cross examination and try to identify when you lost thought, when you got nervous, when you responded poorly. That would be an interesting thing if we ever have a camp, is to have people order a transcript of their cross examination, don't read it, and then bring it to our seminar, and then we can all go over each other's cross examinations that we haven't read ourselves before, but get real feedback on it. That would be like film review from sports.
I love that idea. And you do it with depositions, I think, is the way to
Yeah.
do it because it's so much harder to get across from a trial. But at Depo, we've got tons of those. But we never,
Mm-hmm.
I think we, just like watching film, is not enough lawyers are going back and reading their own depositions critically to say, oh, I missed an opportunity there. I could have dug in more on that part, or I wasn't listening to what the witness was saying, and I could have, changed directions and gone down a whole new path. So that's a great idea.
We'll do a podcast and bring a guest in because I don't think we do enough talking about the difference between a deposition or discovery and a trial, like the presence of the judge versus the non-presence of the judge and how it changes the dynamic. It's so much dependent on the other lawyer, and the bullies can really, you know what I mean? Like that's an interesting dynamic that we'll have to come back and see what they say in the comments. What'd you do this week?
I had two really big hearings this week on cases that I've been working on for years. The first one was an arbitration against Amazon, and Amazon. Actually, it was against AutoNation, a car dealer, and the car dealer has an anti-class action provision in it, which prevents multiple consumers or multiple buyers. Like if two people buy a car,
Mm-hmm.
the same car, like you've got co-signers, like a husband and wife or whatever, and something goes wrong, the language of this AutoNation's arbitration contract says that those two buyers have to go to two separate arbitrations against the company, and it splits them because it's an
Mm-hmm.
anti-class action, anti-consolidation. I said, okay, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if I can't bring multiple arbitrations from the plaintiff's side, you can't consolidate AutoNation and the local dealership and the supervisors and the managers and the mechanics that worked on the thing. And we need 7 separate arbitrations that you have to pay for. What do you think AutoNation said about that? I said, hell no, we're not
Who do
going
you
to pay for
think
that.
you are?
Who do you think you are? So we went to a hearing this week, and I had Supreme Court case law that showed it flipping the other way. And I said, if it's good for them, why isn't it good for us? Why can't we do the same thing? That was the first hearing, and it went really well. I think we haven't gotten a ruling yet, but I'm hopeful. And then the second one was an in-person hearing in court where the insurance company for the person that hit and hurt my client went behind my back and paid an ER bill that their own expert said was worth $2,400. They paid $6,600 for that ER bill. And I've sued them for tortious interference with contract, barratry, and the unlicensed practice of law. And we got past an MSJ this week, which is a huge deal. Nobody's ever gotten
What was
past
the
it.
second one? Barratry?
Barratry is when
Explain that
somebody,
to my Canadian ears.
sure. So barratry is when somebody acts as a lawyer on behalf of somebody without permission.
Ah.
A classic example is like solicitation of somebody, like ambulance chasing is considered barratry in America, where they're running after and putting pressure on the client to sign up with them, and reaching out to the injured person before the injured person reaches out to them. That's kind of classic barratry. But another part of barratry would be, I know that you, Philip, owe somebody else money, so I go negotiate the deal for you without your permission and then force you to take it, act as your
Oof.
lawyer without your permission. And that's what they did. And the judge saw it.
Scummy shit.
Yeah, real scummy shit. The cool thing is it's a
Well, lots to
10,000.
talk about.
Instance.
Yeah, that's cool. You are just you are always coming up with clever solutions. Your Disney article, by the way, I had some people read it and they loved it on that, not knowing about that arbitration and people slagging on Disney's brand. I had an interesting, because we do some personal branding for professionals, lawyers, doctors, and other professionals. I was working with a realtor who's extremely high powerful, high functioning realtor, but her background is she was a commercial real estate lawyer. So she started off in DC doing public defender work, which was interesting. And I was trying to ask her, like, because we were trying to build a brand, I asked, like, why did you become a realtor? Because it's a weird career trajectory. And she couldn't really articulate it, but she was extremely functional and good at her job. And she represents some of the richest people in this city. And you can tell that they trust her. And so she said a lot of people said it was because I worked in commercial real estate. I learned negotiations. People trusted me because I work with high value people. And I said, yeah. I said, but tell me a bit about what you did at the beginning of law. And she was like, well, I kind of primarily worked in representing females who are getting thrown in jail for marijuana and losing their family and their home. And she goes, I fought for 2 to 3 years just trying to keep moms and kids together and families together. And I saw them go out and I saw what it did. And I said, probably there's some link there. You saw the importance of a home, how happy a home was. And then you got into commercial real estate and saw the transaction element of it, and a middle ground between the high-end negotiation was taking families and putting them in the right home. And she looked back and I said, so you saw so many homes broken, but now you're actually putting people in homes where they're going to make beautiful memories. And she got a little bit emotional. Nobody talked to her like that. She goes, this is the best, right?
That's good
Interesting
stuff,
angle.
man. That kind of digging into a person's background and understanding the why for what they're doing is, you do that. You and Camille obviously do that together really well, even more so than like you just said, like the person doesn't recognize the reasons behind their own career trajectory or their own life arc until somebody comes in and starts breaking it down and asking questions like, why did you do this? And why do you think you did that? And then getting to the actual reasons. That's wonderful, man.
Yeah, I guess we should get into the meat of the podcast, but it's been a great conversation for 15 minutes.
And that's our podcast for today. See you later.
Here's my grocery list. And we thought today we'd talk about a couple of high-profile cases that are in the news because I think it's relevant to the general audience, also to lawyers, to talk about how high-profile cases can affect juries, judges, the trial. In negotiation, we call it the negotiation battleground. So you're going into a case, you have to understand what's going on in terms of things you can't control. And I thought we would talk about the Conor McGregor one first and then go into the Menendez brothers because that thing is blowing up TikTok. And I got in an argument with 2 of my daughters this week when I told them we were going to talk about it because they think the kids should go free because they're cute. They were abused, and we had this whole discussion, but we'll save that for the end. What do you think about the Conor McGregor case? And I know it happened in the UK, a little different in the US. What are your first thoughts?
My first thoughts are it's a very low number for what would happen, I think, in the States. And although it does kind of make a little bit of sense in that I think the criminal side fell apart and they ended up not, am I right about this? That they ended up not prosecuting him on the criminal side and then it went into a
Yeah.
civil side. And that's where the verdict came back on the civil side for £250,000, which is a little more than 250 grand in US dollars, which for a guilty verdict on an assault and rape, essentially, I want to make sure I get the naming right because the
I don't think it
UK's,
was full rape, but
yeah,
that's the issue that I've dealt with as a prosecutor and somebody who does a lot of sexual misconduct, personal injury cases, because I think they're kind of, I've tried to move my practice a little bit more into those because I think with self-driving cars, the car crash market is going to shrink
yeah,
just because as you put, SpaceX quality sensors on vehicles, you know, people don't trust them, but generally they're more reliable than humans. And so I think there may be pressure on personal injury lawyers, 5 years down the road if accidents go down. But it, I just find like they stop using the term rape and it's just sexual assault, which is like tap at a butt to full forced rape. You know what I mean? Like, and so you have this term that's so broadly applied. I don't think it covers the difference, but uh,
oh,
uh,
for sure, for sure it doesn't. It's
yeah,
too generalized.
most of the lawyers know that obviously civil OJ is the best example, right? Found not guilty, but then a civil suit and gets found liable under the 51% proof standard versus the kind of 90% proof standard. And I think a lot of people are a little bit shy about taking on cases where a criminal prosecution has failed because they don't understand how high of a bar it is to get to beyond a reasonable doubt. And I've had many cases where the judge is like, I think this happened, but I can't be sure it happened. So I have to find you not guilty. But if somebody thinks it happens, that's 51% balance of probabilities. You got a civil case there. And
Yeah.
there are cases out there for people.
Oh, for sure. And I have one in my firm right now. And the problem, uh, it's a physical assault, not a sexual assault. It was between two males or a group of males.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the problem with getting the case settled is that the assaulter was found not guilty in criminal court. And I believe that he still has some financial responsibility for it based on what you just said. But convincing this guy of that is going to be extremely difficult. And the question then becomes how hard do you want to push it? And how far do we want to push it? Because if the defense just acts unreasonably and says we got off on the criminal side, we're not going to pay attention to your civil side, then now we got to go to trial to try to get a jury to tell them otherwise. And then even if we do, they're going to appeal it. So we're looking at a 3 to 5 year fight because he doesn't understand the difference between criminal and civil liability.
But isn't it hard to appeal a jury verdict like than a bench trial? You know what I mean? Like when they come back with 51%, they don't have to give reasons. Like they appeal the verdict number probably, right? Because you guys get much higher verdicts in England and Canada. But
So that's true. It's very easy to appeal. It's very difficult to win. But
hmm.
appealing it on its own sets you up for like a year and a half to 2 year battle in the appellate court because it takes that long to find out if you won or not. And then the appellate court can just completely take it away and say reversed and rendered, you're out.
Hmm. We've got an appeal right now where we had a case where police screwed up a criminal investigation, and then we took it to civil trial, and we went bench trial, judge alone, and ended up winning convincingly. Judge was actually like the police screwed it up, but then the idiot, he's kind of he's appealing it, saying he's almost going self-repped, and he's like, I won the criminal trial. I shouldn't lose this one, right? So then we have to kind of try and secure costs, and it's frustrating for the victim. But for those people out there, stay connected with, centers for abused women, and never forget men. There's a lot. If they say the numbers 1 out of 3 women are have been victims of sexual assault. 1 out of 6 men, but men have a very hard time talking about it. And that's where you guys kind of suffer because we don't have a limitation period for a sexual assault because our courts have determined that sometimes you're so abused that you can't speak about it until you're ready to speak about it because you've just buried it, especially if it happened from a family member when you're 16, right? An uncle, right? You just bury it and you can only survive by not talking about it. So our courts don't want to punish you, but then it makes it harder to get a fair trial too because everything is so dated. But depending on your jurisdiction, there's a lot of money to be made in these cases if you can identify real cases of abuse.
Yeah, and the law in the states is catching up to that. It's gotten better to where
Mm-hmm.
in Texas you don't. It's not just a straight statute of limitations. It used to be within 5 years, I think, of turning 18. Now there's provisions that allow it to go for years after that, and so we are getting better at that. But it's not.
To me, it's kind of different. We have it if the person was in a position of trust or some sort of fiduciary, priest, teacher, employer, right? Our courts have interpreted that to mean that it could be harder for you to come forward because that priest is so powerful in your community, or a family member, or a teacher, as opposed to if it's just a random person and you don't report it. So whenever there's a breach of trust by a person in a fiduciary position, there's no limitation period, which is interesting. So we should know that.
So
But it's
I think that's a great. I think that's a great thing for the law to do. Let me ask you. Let me ask you a question. This came up this week, and I've been thinking about this lately. Is how do you handle in your practice when you take cases or you take on causes that may not fit neatly within the law the way it is currently, and you're arguing for either fitting a new type of case into an old law or fitting a case in pushing the law and pushing the bounds of the law because it needs to catch up with what's going on, what's actually going on in society. How do you handle?
it kind of dovetails a little bit into what we're going to talk about with Menendez, in that the courts always try to appear at some way to be dispassionate, fair, you know what I mean? But as a groundswell or a zeitgeist changes public opinion, especially in the US because so many people are elected, right? So I find like you can really get a different interpretation of the law because of the elected element of it. So what we've seen with the Me Too movement is a far greater openness to charging cases that were weaker in the past. Nothing changed in the law necessarily. And then, but when you're advocating for victims, I would tell people to be bold. You know what I mean? Because you might not get all the way down the field, but you can certainly get past halfway and make a change, and then get your name out there, and then somebody else comes and does it. You don't have to be the solo climber of Everest to make it happen. But like if there are victim groups that aren't being properly represented, and there's things that stop it, like push it, and then find other people to push it because you got to break that wall down through a series of hits. But I think too many people think of it independently and say, "Oh, I can't do it; it's too much."
Oh yeah, and I think obviously it can't be your whole practice. You've got to do something
Yeah.
with money, and you've got to keep the lights on and the doors open. But I think it's an important part of a lawyer's practice to have a certain number of cases or a certain number of issues where you're challenging the law, where you're challenging the status quo, and you're kind of out on a ledge pushing things to advocate on behalf of your client and other people similarly situated. And I think if we're not doing that, it's like, everybody wants to say they fight for whatever and change the law, but like you're not going to just wake up and find some issue that you're going to change the law on and go argue in front of the US Supreme Court or the Texas Supreme Court or whatever. Like you've got to practice these things, and taking on different issues help us to think about the law and frame the law in a way, and then we can practice in front of the judges and against the other side, and work on how developing that strategy and that skill set to be able to do that, right?
Mhm. That's a good point. It's like I was just thinking, like it's like if you want to go hunting, right? Like you're not going to just go hunting brand new and then all of a sudden have the best trophy animal come perfectly in front of you to hit it, right? Like you got to spend the time in the bush, or you got to do the reps fighting so that when that big opportunity comes, you are ready. And if it comes early, you got to find help or mentors. But too many people are like waiting for the giant one to come. And to your point, when I talk to a younger lawyer, I'm always like, you should always have a couple cases on your list that are scary to you, right? Because other people won't take them, but you're never going to be great if you're only taking slam dunks. Like all these people who say fight, what they've done is borrowed money for advertising, and they spend a lot of money on advertising, and then they take the slam dunks, farm out the rest, and they're not actually fighting. They just have a business model because they could spend $5 million on advertising to get cases that don't really require passion, right? And but if you want to be a lawyer who achieves greatness or loves their life, and greatness doesn't have to be private jet. Greatness is just people love you in your community. They have to know they can come to you because. But the other thing is it's hard for lawyers, especially people who become trial lawyers who aren't really made for it, who don't want to ever be criticized, because like I was thinking about it even from politics this week. I was back in the original Gulf War, the first one under Bush Senior. I was in the military, but I was kind of starting in some of the first CrossFits that were out there. I don't know if you've ever done a CrossFit, but this guy named Greg Glassman started CrossFit. He's very pro-military. And I remember being a Canadian guy who had deployed, and I was saying, this war is bullshit. And he's like, you're un-American. I'm just saying, like, sometimes going against what the institutions say is right. You can end up being right, but you don't really get validated for 5 or 10 years later. But at the time that I was saying, there's no weapons of mass destruction. Like, this is a constructed war to generate money for the defense industry and secure oil reserves. But I think a lot of lawyers, they don't want to seem wrong in the present, even though it feels right to do it. And I think your advice I've seen you give is, if it feels right, take a run at it. But don't base your whole practice on it.
Right. It's a part of being a better lawyer. I think that feeling. I think you kind of said it is, if not me, then who? If I don't do this, who's going to do it? And if you've ever felt that way, I wrote an article about this week for Justice Colleges. If you're as a lawyer looking at situations and you've ever felt that, if not me, then who? That's what Justice College is looking for. That's who we're looking for, is people that have that kind of internal fire and fortitude to stand up for things that they think are right, even if the law says you're wrong. It's like, no, I'm right, and the law needs to change. And as a lawyer, I'm allowed to argue for a change in the law, and I'm going to acknowledge it. I'm going to be upfront with it. I'm going to say this is what I'm doing, but this is the right thing to do. And I think that's a big part of being a lawyer. For me, it is. That's a big part of my passion.
Yeah, it was one of the worst excuses for doing something one way is when somebody, well, that's the way we've always done it. Right? Like that's just, but that brings us back to our podcast with Dr. Barrett. I still have like beautiful thoughts from it, but remember when he said the Abilene paradox, that a group of people will all agree to something because they think everybody else thinks it's the only way it can be done, but they all wish somebody would say something. And I think that happens in lawyers, right? And then all of a sudden you're the one person who goes, why are we doing this? Makes no sense. Yep. And then all of a sudden everybody's like, I've been thinking the same thing for a long time, but there's been silence for 5 years about the point.
Yes.
Well, and stand up and be Spartacus.
Stand up and be Spartacus. Some people don't have that ability to go against the wave of what's around them. And I think that can be developed. It can be learned. Why not? Why can't we learn to think in that way, or learn to be to stand up for people? I mean, I still remember the first time I went to trial for some clients, and I was in charge. It was my case, and I was the lead lawyer, and I had to make the decision as to whether the amount the insurance company was offering was sufficient. And the clients come in and tell me they've been eating ramen noodles for 2 weeks because they don't have any money, and I'm like, this is a big decision for these people. And I've gone from that to learning and developing those skills, and learning to understand that pressure and that privilege to represent people like that, and then how to handle it. You're not just going to walk out of law school, pass the bar, and then say, okay, I'm going to represent people in multi-million-dollar cases. Like, that's not the way the world works.
Yeah, because my dad said I'm smart.
Exactly. So give me the multi-million-dollar cases, right?
Yeah, because if I don't get them, I can just send my parents to argue with the professors. to make sure I get the wow. Speaking of which, I was walking around Harvard during the week, and it just looked like a clown festival of dysfunctional human beings. Like I taught there 12 years ago on negotiation for a summer, and I remember walking there and feeling the vibe of like people who were serious about studying, right? And it was interesting walking around campus. Like it was very much kind of an advocacy vibe. Who can wear more ribbons? Who can have more signs up? Like it just has a I think from a brand perspective, you're seeing the death of a brand there, even though it's such a good brand.
Good brands come down too.
Yeah, so I think when we're looking to finish up on the Conor McGregor angle, don't shy away from cases just because they didn't get a conviction. Some good stuff there. 51% when you have a sympathetic client is a great number because all you got to do is get the jurors or the judge to say, "Yeah, I think it happened," right? Not, "I'm sure it happened." And the other thing, though, that I think is interesting, we should talk about another time. I'm going to try and fix my lighting in here in a second. Um, is though how strategic litigation can be based on the pockets of the defendant, based on the high profile, like you see now in politics. I think it's almost going to become a de facto thing. As soon as somebody gets appointed that you don't like, go find somebody who can say they sexually did something to them in the past and then call for them to be fired. Like it's a vulnerability, and it's hard to protect our system from it being manipulated by bad actors.
That's well said, I think. That's a big problem. Man, I want to get into the Menendez stuff because I
All
think
right, let's do Menendez.
everything we've been talking about so far applies to this crazy Menendez case. And there were a lot of things in there that I remember. It's kind of like watching the O.J. Simpson documentary. It was like there's a lot of things in there that I remember, but there were a lot of new stuff. I didn't know all of the background. And that criminal defense lawyer, the little blonde lady, is exactly what we've been talking about on this show so far. Is she's the one that created this, or kind of pushed it to the forefront of this battered abuse survivor defense, and how to present that and how it can affect juries and judges with that second trial. The judge keeping all that evidence out to try to kind of rig the sentencing, because it had happened just after the Rodney King verdict.
Mm-hmm.
All of the historical backdrop to when that trial was happening, not just what was going on within the trial, but when it was happening. It's fascinating.
So if you haven't heard of the Menendez brothers trials, I'm glad that you woke up from your coma. Like, I'm glad things worked out for you. But if you're just hearing about it, these two very rich young boys killed their mom and dad when they were about 18 and 20 or 21 in LA, and the LA police were not well equipped to do kind of complex murder investigations, and they weren't charged at first. I find it's interesting, the story, and I want to get into it, whether or not what you think happened, because when I looked at the documentary, I personally had some issues with the testimony, but why it's become popular is TikTok has gone crazy over it, and so a documentary can change. I think there's documentaries now are resulting in changing verdicts. But they shot their parents with shotguns in cold blood, dumped the shotguns. They bought the shotguns through a buddy's ID. They went to a movie, came back, and called 911. And then were subsequently convicted after the second trial. Where are you at with it? What do you think is the state? Like, how are you feeling having watched the documentary about the fairness of the conviction?
I think it would be a very different trial today than it was back then. I mean, the first trial ended in a mistrial because all of the males voted for murder conviction, and all the females wanted a misdemeanor or a negligent homicide finding, and that was how they deadlocked. Because the men apparently on the first jury could not believe that a father would abuse his sons, in the way that they were these boys were told. And goodness gracious, I mean, talk about witness prep. Uh, However you feel about the story, like the watching those guys, those young men testify in that first trial, whether they're telling the truth or not, like that is a very difficult thing to do. However you feel
Yeah.
about what happened there, I mean, that's amazing. It was amazing video to watch
So
that.
it's interesting from my perspective, an ex-prosecutor, because there is the battered wife defense, right? Which is you are a prisoner in your house, you can't leave, you've been beat so many times, another beating is coming, and you just can't deal with it anymore, and you shoot them because there's no escape left, and that's not really controversial now, even though the first person who raised it is like what we were talking about earlier, right? But it I find this is I find this is a warped misuse of it that's getting traction on social media because I think everybody has been highly sensitized to trying to find a victim. Like, if you could murder anybody who had abused you in the past, some people might say it's good, but it's not really true. So whether or not the dad abused him in the past as much as they said, it's hard to validate because he's dead. Is a long way after. But you may start seeing kind of a Menendez defense coming out of this. Is like, I planned to buy a gun. I used fake ID to buy it. I then went there and executed my parents, and then went to a movie, and then stayed in the house for 4 days and lied to the police. And then after I got arrested, I came to court in nice sweaters. We call it the sweater defense, and then cried about being treated poorly,
Yeah.
right? And but from a documentary perspective, you couldn't make up. I wanted to talk about how experts can vary on cases. Like that one expert, like lunatics. Like,
Crazy. You're talking about the male psychiatrist or psychologist who was sharing notes with the father and doing all that crazy stuff.
yeah, and then his assistant accused him of rape mid-trial, and then the female who was talking to one of the brothers in court and fell in love with him and was recording it, and he admitted that he was lying. Like, the Menendez brother admitted that he was lying to elicit sympathy, and I think everybody's ignoring that,
Yeah.
right? And that evidence never got in because she had developed personal relationships with him, but the recording says, yeah, I admit I was exaggerating things to elicit sympathy on the stand. I think these are incredibly high-functioning spoiled brats, right? Who killed their parents for the inheritance and didn't do a good job. And then because they had counsel, they came up with the, hey, he was mean to us or he abused us, and he may or may not have, but at 18 and 21, you can leave, right?
Sure.
And you didn't leave, but then you shoot your parents and you stay in the house and go buy Porsches and Rolexes. To me, that's not the habit of a. But I want to play. I'm going to see if I can share the beginning of the documentary and ask you what you think of the 911 call. Let me see if you can hear
Oh,
that. Yeah.
goodness gracious. Yeah.
Let me see if I can.
When they get back from the movie theater and they're calling 911 and they're
Yeah, here, I'll
screaming
play
and
it
crying
here.
and all that noise in the background. And
Yeah, so this is to me interesting. Let's see if you guys can hear it. Can you hear that? Could you hear that?
oh, yeah.
So from my perspective here, now in Canada, 911 tapes aren't admissible for the proof of their contents. You can get it for context, but there's a lot of experts out there who will say, like, when I look at that tape, that person sounds believable or not based on human behavior. But I thought what was most striking about that is he calls up, he's like, hey, police.
Yeah.
Hey, what's up? And then she goes, what happened? And then he starts going, my parents are like, from my perspective, having dealt with a lot of victims, you generally don't see an emotional state change that much. Like, if anybody's ever called the police 911, I had one of my children go unconscious with a very high fever, and I didn't know about febrile fever, which if the temperature gets so high, your kid can go unconscious. Uh, I didn't know about that. I thought my child was dying, my little baby. And I called 911, and I remember I could barely speak, right? And I'm like, I was a combat soldier who had been tested under some very trying situations, and I could barely speak, but I wasn't like, hey, police, what's up? Oh my God, you know what I mean? Like, so it was very interesting. Plus, I don't know why you heard this scream. And I don't know why the trial, there seemed like there was a third person screaming there. Like you
I
hear
think it was
this
the brother.
scream.
I think it was the
Yeah.
brother in the background, and they had probably planned it as like, "Hey, I'm going to call the police, but you keep screaming in the background." And they probably talked about that because it
That
just
doesn't,
sounded.
it doesn't make sense because they tried to make it look like a mafia hit because he was connected, right? And then he's like, Eric, don't. Like what?
Told
But the
what?
police came that day, didn't think they were suspects, didn't interview them, didn't search their car, didn't do gunpowder residue. But I just thought when I'm starting off and I listen to that 911 tape, I have serious issues
Oh yeah,
about the sincerity of the. Now, they now said later that they decided to lie because of the abuse. So then that actually makes sense because they were lying, but they're saying that they were doing it because they were just abused kids who had knew nothing else to do. But
well, okay, so let's use it. Let's use it for that, right? Because it's a good example of somebody that's showing fake emotion and how that fake emotion happens, right? So you've got a very powerful situation here. You've got an authentic 911 call from somebody who's lying about what happened to the police. And what are the keys and what are the contexts that you can look at now, knowing that he's lying, to be able to tell that he's lying? And I think that change in the emotion from "Hey, police" to "Somebody killed my parents" is a big clue. Like it doesn't happen that way in real life.
no, very odd. I wanted to share because I remember when I was watching documentary, everybody's like, "Oh, it's so sad." I don't think anybody had really talked about that in a court case too much, but I find there's some grief. I want to share the grief of the younger guy when he took the stand.
Mm.
Do you remember that? Like, so what did you think? The first guy I think is Kyle, right? The older guy,
Lyle.
Lyle, and he's the first guy to testify to this. Like, I just couldn't believe the fire of the shots. But when the brother was talking about the abuse, what I want you guys to look at is the eyebrows. Sorry, not the eyebrows. The eyes don't lie as much as the face. So I think you've heard of that in smiling, right? A
Yep.
fake smile, you'll see the mouth move, but if the eyebrows don't move,
Yeah,
uh,
there's some muscles around the eyes that when somebody's smiling authentically contract, and when they're not smiling authentically, they don't contract, and it's a real clue to what's going on. What was the name of that?
oh, there's so many books on this. I've studied this for hours and
What was
hours.
the
But then
name?
also with grief is shown in this muscle right here, like real grief. And if I encourage all the trial lawyers to study human behavior, one of the top books to start with, I think, is called The Naked Ape, and it's a biological evolutionary biologist who studies how animals develop uh, instinctive reactions to social gatherings, and humans have done it, and the same humans do it the same across all cultures. They show joy, grief, frustration, and anger the same way from a tribe in Africa to a Chinese person to an American when they're hit with an emotion that they're not planned for.
Yep, that's
And
emotions
especially,
revealed. That's emotions revealed by Paul Ekman. That talks. He did
oh
a
yeah,
study.
Ekman, yeah, I've taken his course.
I have
He
two.
does the micro expressions,
Yeah.
right? And that's why you slow things down uh, because our eyes can't often pick up micro expressions, like when people are being deceitful. But when you tell something about something for the first time, there'll often be a micro expression that reveals what they truly feel, and then they mask it right away. And so if you're ever watching a deposition, at an important part, try this. Go at half or 25% speed and watch the witness. And if you know when the question is, you can often see a micro expression before they put themselves back together. It's really interesting.
So one of the things I love about taking Zoom depositions or online depositions is that there's that little delay, and so I
Mm-hmm.
can ask a question, and then I can
Mm-hmm.
watch a second or so later their reaction to my question. Whereas if it's an in-person conversation, it happens instantaneously almost. But when
Oh
there's
yeah,
that
yeah,
little
actually.
pause online, you can see it, and you're like, "Oh, there's something happened there," and jump
And
on it.
people don't pay attention to blink rate. So if
Yeah.
you're really interested in something, you're watching a movie, you'll see the blink rate will be very low. It'll be like 5 blinks a minute. 3 to 6 would be
Yeah.
normal, right? Because
Yeah.
you're watching. But when people get very stressed or nervous, watch their eyes. The blink rate can go up to 30 to 40 a minute because the brain, it's almost like fluttering as a computer is trying to process because when you're lying, you have to have so many tabs open. When you're telling the truth, it shouldn't be that demanding on your brain
I like
because it's
that.
right there. It's a clear line. But when you're lying, you've got a previous story with another story with something that you think somebody else is going to say, and you're getting asked a question, wondering what the next question is. And so all of a sudden you kind of go, so watch in a deposition, whenever you see a significant change in blink rate, that means something is happening. It doesn't mean they're lying, but it means you need to watch it. And so one of the ways we do it is always ask questions early that establish a baseline. So ask questions that a person is comfortable talking about things that you know are the truth, and you can see how their hands work, what they do, and then for the remainder of the discovery, watch for deviations from the baseline.
Yeah.
So whenever you see them do a deviation, and this is what being an outstanding trial lawyer is, if you can pick that up on the go, you know, okay, well, I'm going to close my notebook here that I'm attached to it. I'm going to go down that hole because I just saw a deviation and I need to explore it a bit. It's a bit of a risk.
Yeah, you use your like I don't write out my questions, and I never
Mm-hmm.
really did. I would write out some key questions, like when it's on the elements of exactly what I need. I'll write out the law so I can get the wording right. But for the most part, my cross examinations, my directs, my depots are done through topics and like big picture ideas of what I'm doing, so that I can then understand the topic and then focus on the witness for when I'm trying to get information about that topic. But I've learned you got to be careful when you call out people for those changes, like when their eyes start fluttering, because you can spook them, and it's easy. It's what I do sometimes now is I'll wait a couple questions, or I'll do it in a kind of a softer way. Is like, hey, I got the sense from the way you answered that question, or that there was something else going on there. Is there something you'd want to expand on to answer that question, or was there something you were thinking about before answering that? And it's interesting to watch them then get called out in that way and see how they react to that.
Yeah, and it's making the call of because you can get shut down when you push down in there. Sometimes that fluttering can be there's a trigger to a trauma that you're not aware of
Yeah.
that's causing them to do it, right? So you don't want to assume it or go. One of the other things I've done, I think we talked about it, is try this with your significant other partner, whatever. Ask them 5 questions about memory. So if they say, Chuck, what did you have for breakfast on Thursday morning?
Toast and strawberries and blueberries.
All right. Now imagine the best retirement home. What would it look like for you? What would be your best retirement home
Oh,
ever?
it's in the mountains, bro. It's in the mountains, man.
Describe it though. What does it look like?
Uh, it's it's on a little bit of a hill. It's looking out over either a mountain or a lake or something. But yeah, it's up in the mountains. It's up
Yeah.
at
So you can try this out with your partner and spouse if you had more time we would do it. But ask your partner or spouse 3 or 4 memory questions, and your eyes went up and a little bit to your left. But when you were
oh,
describing your
Toast was over
yeah,
here. Toast is up here
yeah,
to the left, and then the house that I don't have is
yeah.
up here to the right.
So when you're creating memories, you're using a different side of your brain, and your eyes go to that side. And when you're accessing memories, it's in a storage unit, so you go to the other side. You can. It's not perfect, but it is something I've used. If you get to do a deposition a second time or something, and you establish a pattern.
I've got a great story of one. We had a lady who was driving she's in the right lane of the highway, passing kind of slowly passing this big 18 wheeler, and another 18 wheeler comes from the right to merge onto the highway. So she's kind of stuck, and she's got to make a decision of what to do. And so she
Mm.
speeds up a little bit to try to get past the merging truck. And the merging 18 wheeler crosses over the lane and merges into her lane and kind of sandwiches her. And so she turns to the left and goes right in front of the big 18 wheeler on her left and goes spinning down the highway. And she says when she turns left, she can feel and hear that that engine going, right? And then I'm start asking her about what happens after the crash when she's recovering, and she's living with her dad a few weeks after this occurred, and her dad is like, we need to get you in the car, we need to get you out of the house, let's go. And he puts her into his diesel truck. He's got a pickup truck that has a diesel engine, and she's like, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. And he finally gets her in the front seat, and he walks around and he gets in and he cranks that engine, and I see her eyes go straight to the left, and she loses it. And she goes,
Wow.
the next thing I remember is I'm on the floorboard curled up in a ball. And I go, did you hear something that caused that? And she goes, yeah, it was the diesel engine. It sounded like the same thing as that engine when I'm going left in front of that 18-wheeler. So when she went directly to the left like that, I knew that she was accessing a saved memory of a sound. And when I asked her about it, she was able to pull back that sound of the diesel engine that triggered me.
Another thing I would, just in terms of giving tips to our trial lawyer community, the breathing is so important. And I didn't do this for the first number of years in my practice, but we tend to focus on the details and the facts in our trial preparation and the presentation in terms of breathing. And when people get nervous, they lock down. You know how rabbits, I think it's called tharn, like they just freeze when a bird of prey is over them, and they say as little as possible, but that's not convincing, right? Convincing is where you have enough air. By the way, did we ever talk about what butterflies are? So I love this. So butterflies, this came from doing some training with some elite units in the military. Most of our blood is stored in our small intestine, right? Because that's where it takes a lot of blood through all that intestine to process food as it goes through and absorb it in, right? So when we're not doing anything, I think it's almost over 1/3 of our body's blood is in our small intestine vessels. And so this is what you're going to love. And I tell people who are nervous about speaking, when the body thinks it's in danger or has to perform for its survival, it releases cortisone and adrenaline, and it shoots all of the blood from your stomach into your muscles and your brain. That's why you feel butterflies. It is the blood rapidly leaving your stomach to go to your muscles and your brain. And I tell people, when you feel butterflies, that's your body saying, I'm ready for this. I now have my blood in my muscles and in my brain. I can do great things. So don't turn it into something terrifying. That's just an aside, sorry, but I was going, when we prep witnesses, you can actually put a little bandage around their stomach underneath their clothes, like a tensor wrap. And you tell them to be aware of it because it's like they're being hugged, and they breathe against the tensor wrap in the stomach, because one of the reasons people lose air when they're talking is they start taking shallow breaths, and they're depleting the kind of storage, and now you're kind of breathing from here, and you can see you're like, right? And take a pause and breathe deep in your stomach. But by putting a little bandage, even if you're a new trial lawyer, under your suit, wrap a tensor bandage around your stomach and be cognizant of pressing against that tension. It makes you feel safer, but it will really calm you, and it'll calm a witness so they can tell their story better. Let me share. Let's take a little look at the one kid here, and you tell me from a grief perspective. I thought this might be interesting. This is the first guy. So he's got tears here, and people can recreate tears. We see this all the time, and people should study why people cry, who can cry on demand, because I think too often crying is determinative in cases, and liars can be great criers. I'm not saying he is. So his mouth looks sad. His eyes are red, but sadness can sometimes be conveyed. You adopt the sadness of your situation, and you remember being yelled at, so that sociopathic and psychotic people can mimic it. But like his eyes are searching, like look at the biting of his lower lip there. You see this little smile, the lip kind of curling up? It's interesting. So you see that his body is closed up, his arms are in front of him. He's turned a little bit sideways to the person. He's going back and forth, but the smiling is actually odd. It's almost, to me, a little bit, you can't diagnose somebody, but it looks like a little bit like there's something mental going on there that's quasi-psychotic or bipolar, because is that nervousness? But look at how locked his eyes are right there. on the lawyer. Eyes lock on a lawyer when eyes lock on a human when they're perceiving threat, but it seems we'll just play it a bit more and tell me what you think as he gets upset.
3.5 years.
Mr. Menendez, during the summer of 1980, if you get too close, it pops.
Oh, I just want, there's a
Yes.
tiny bit. This muscle right here, if you can see my cursor,
Okay.
real grief is shown here.
I'm thinking to myself.
And there's a tiny bit of it.
So
How long have
can you pause it? So he's turning away from the questioner, right? Now he's more facing her. Like before she started the first question, he was kind of turned away and looking back. He takes this big, like high breath in the top of his chest, right when the first question starts. And then she asks where he lives, and he looks up and to the right and says the county jail. So that tells me that his eyes are reversed, which happens in 10% of the population of
Yeah.
where I would look up and left to see where I live. If somebody asked me where do I live, I would look up and to the left to see my house. He looks up and to the right. That's kind of a baseline question of, we know he's not lying, right? And so we can tell
You got it.
where he's going to look. Then she asks another question about, did you, in a second here, did you kill your parents, or no, were you sexually molested by your father? And he looks up and to the right and says yes again, right? So that would mean he accessed some kind of a remembered vision in that question.
And that memory can be a baseline of where the story comes from as well. I'm not saying he wasn't abused, but it could be he was hit by his parent, his dad, he was beat up by his parent, or he was molested by his parent. But if you have an anchor point, you can go to that anchor point to tell a story. But that's a great pickup by Tall Chuck, who's a master of body language. Let's watch a bit more.
Mr. Nine?
Breath. He looks down knowing the question's coming.
So you see a little bit of grief muscle here. Can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Right above the nose. You see a little bit of the mouth is there, but to me, that forward jaw, to me, my perspective is it looks a little manufactured. I don't know the individual because you've waited all this time to go on trial, but it's not. Different people show grief differently, so you don't want to make a conclusion. But she, as a lawyer, gets right into this, right? Like
great.
there's not really a build up to it, but it doesn't come across the detail. I think we've talked about it. The details in historic sexual assaults, you don't have to remember all of the details, but usually there are some very clear things that victims can remember. Like I remember looking up at the ceiling and I could see the light fixture.
Remember, he says that here in a second. He doesn't remember shooting, but he remembers the picture in the background. And they don't explain that, but I think what he remembers is the blood hitting the back of that picture.
Yeah. And when it comes to childhood sexual abuse, often kids remember certain details or how they disassociated themselves with great memory, but they can't remember other things. But I watched a bit more of this. She never really got into the detail, and maybe that's because back then it was way more difficult to talk about this stuff. But, there's lots more in there. I recommend people watch it, tell you what you think. But I just think, my prosecutor background is you shot your parents in cold blood. You could have left. You wanted the cash, and there was an insurance thing. Like but my daughters and a lot of their friends are like, oh my God, they were so cute. I can't believe they got sent to jail when their dad was doing all this bad stuff. And I don't think it's really, if you shot your father because he was going to rape your brother, you know what I mean? But usually teenage boys who do that right around puberty at 15, 16. That's when they get that kind of testosterone push and there's a pushback. It doesn't usually happen at 21 when you're about to go to Princeton, right? And you can buy. So, let us know what you think about this particular case. But I think what we're focusing on is understanding trauma in your clients and the witnesses makes you a better lawyer. And I think not enough people ask 5 questions deep about what's really going on. They think the first version they're told is the version. And usually a lot of people who have trauma, it takes them 5 or 6 goes to actually give themselves permission to talk about that. And lawyers, a lot of lawyers, that's why you've used some amazing lawyers to get there that are more skilled than us.
Yeah, I think that's Watching documentaries like this to me is fascinating, especially when you're seeing a video of somebody in that high stress situation, because you can see his face so clearly and his body language, and whether, not everything that person is saying is a lie, clearly, and we know some parts of the
Yeah.
story that they're saying are true. So the question is, was he lying about how he felt about it? Was he lying about, who did what, or where things were? I don't know, but you can see, he lived in the jail. So when he answered that question under that high stress situation, he answered that question truthfully, and you can see how he reacts there, and then go through the rest of the testimony to see what are some of the other changes in his body language and his face when he's answering other questions that we don't really know the answer to compare them to that baseline you were talking about from the beginning.
Yeah, and I've had cases where it turned out where I defended somebody who said they were innocent, and the complainant was very bad crying on the stand, and we luckily were able to determine later that she was lying through some other proof. And what we were able to find is the crying doesn't come at the assault; it comes at the presentation of contradictions. So it was interesting. But then the judge is like, "Oh my God, she's crying. She must be. You're badgering her." But I just said, like, you said that happened here, but this is what it actually says on the records here. And she's like, "I just can't deal with how much this hurts to talk about the rape." And the judge is like, "Mr. Miller, and I'm like, pay attention that when the tears come from being confronted with your contradictions, it's amazing how good they can come there. And if they kind of dispassionately talk about the abuse, but then cry when they're confronted with lies, that's a red flag." But this judge wasn't having any of it.
Yeah, the judge
Luckily,
was not, especially at the second trial, was not having it. He was like, "We're getting a conviction out of this. We're going twice."
Yeah, or it was a bit of a kangaroo trial, that first one. Like,
Well, it sounds like both of them were. The second one was a real kangaroo trial of, we're not letting any evidence in of the abuse. It's just, did he kill his father? Like, whew.
Okay. No, to me, abuse goes to mitigating on sentence. But because manslaughter is a crime of passion, right? I walk in, you see your wife with somebody else, you could lose it and kill him. But when you go and borrow somebody's ammunition and ID to buy 2 shotguns, and then you dispose of them and you lie, like premeditated murder, like to me, it just goes to sentencing, not to the offense. But I think in LA too, once there's a big case, everybody's an ex-actor or an actress, and so they're running to get on the trial so they can get seen on.
For sure. I think, getting back to the point that you just made is, how long can that reaction occur before it's not legally justifiable? So you walk in on your wife, and or a guy walks in on his wife and sees her cheating and pulls the trigger right then. Okay, that's clear.
Yeah.
Like, we can all say, okay, that's within the passion of the moment and the emotions. But let's say he walks in, sees them, walks back downstairs, opens the safe, grabs his gun, goes back upstairs and shoot him. Is that like 2-minute gap too long to hold him to let him off on that? And then you go to the part that you're making of like, okay, you have a passionate moment, and then you leave, you take somebody's ID, you go buy a gun, you plan this thing out, and then you go and shoot him. Is that too long? And so there's a gray area in there, I think, which we have to deal with. And I think it's clear what is and what isn't, but there's a part in the middle, like everything else, of like, what do we do in this situation?
Fascinating stuff, my friend. Lots of human behavior for lawyers to dig into. We're still learning after decades at this. Everybody else should be digging into this stuff. Any final thoughts as we wrap up here?
Just that I value the criminal experience that you have in a lot of ways, and I think this show has really kind of shown that, and how valuable it is. And we use, when you're talking about personal injury stuff, it's about trauma, and criminal defense prosecutors know a lot about trauma that we as civil lawyers, we have to learn, and we owe it to our clients, and we owe it to the situation and ourselves as a career to be learning that type of stuff. And if we're not spending that time to actually learn human behavior, are we really spending the time to be the best? I think it's easy to see lawyers speaking at a CLE that have won millions and millions and millions of dollars in verdicts and say, they're just celebrities. But how much did they struggle to get there? How much research did they do to really understand human behavior, and where are they in that process? And it's easy to dismiss, but I think sometimes it's worthwhile to kind of dig in and take people for the experience and the expertise they have, like you, and learn from that. So I think hopefully that has come out in this episode.
Well, good news for our listeners is I'm working on getting one of the top experts on body language and human behavior in the States onto our podcast as a guest to talk about how he's done a lot of consulting with trial lawyers, but privately. So hopefully I can get him on as a guest and we can pick a case and go through it and help our listeners.
And then we got to bring him back with your buddy that was on a couple weeks ago for the psychologist. That'd be fascinating.
Yeah, I actually work with him, my buddy, on a case, a big case that I can't talk about, but the stuff we came up with was amazing in terms of what we call it is influencing the battlefield, the negotiation battlefield prior to the trial. So you can win it by getting stories out, by doing stuff, and it was fascinating. If you guys like what you're hearing, please follow us, subscribe, and share it to your friends. We want to get as many trial lawyers as possible to get access to this free material that helps everybody get a little better and build a community of people who care about making a difference in the world of prosecuting people who are guilty of civilian injustice. Because we are more than personal injury plaintiff lawyers. We are the people who go out and hold bad actors accountable so you can get your life back.
Justice through accountability.
Till next time, my friend.
Nice job.